Great. Thank you very much. And really, thanks everybody for joining this conversation we're trying to hold this morning. What I'm going to try to do is to carry out a meta exercise on the findings, as you've seen what Athanasius presented and also what she shared with us. We now begin to think maybe a little bit more conceptually about these practices that have been identified, and then try to see how we can apply these to the global health space, because at the end of the day, our project is about global health. So I'm going to try to do this reflection in 3 steps. It's a bit complex sometimes, and I'll try to keep to the time. So Julian, do mark the time for me so that I do not run out of the time space. But let's see what I can synthesize. And this is my understanding of the findings that I'm sharing. It's not definitive. And it is not, it is something that I'm putting out there so that we can have feedback on it and have a conversation around it. And as the project is going on, we'll keep refining our thinking. So the 3 steps will be, common understandings of the self that we have encountered in our empirical work and the workshops, and 2 accounts of solidarity that I have identified from these findings, and how these can be enacted or applied in the global health space. Next slide. So one of the interesting things that we found, especially from the cases that were presented at the workshops, is this idea of a relational understanding of the self. People conceive of themselves not, and this is interesting, not as interconnected or interdependent, because these are the words that we tend to use in academia. But the inter means you are constituted and then you create the relationship. Here, what we are noticing in our findings is that it is not that you are constituted and then you relate to other people, so you are interconnected. It is that your act of actually being is already interconnected. And therefore, you cannot extricate yourself from your relationship with other people to be an individual being that then gets interconnected. And in the literature, what I found, the Latin American authors, Pacari and some of the more recent ones, use the term not interconnected or interdependent, or if you want to go to relato, relatum, and relatio, but rather in Spanish, they talk about vincularidad, which means bondedness. So your being is bonded. Just to give an example from one of the, communities that I'm very familiar with, you actually sometimes do not even introduce yourself with your first name as we do in English. You start with your family name before you come to your first name. So this is the underlying thinking that we're saying. So, and this bondedness can be with nature, it can be with other beings, it can be with your ancestors, it can be with the future generations. And so we are situated as bonded beings. Next slide. Now, this, has been theorized in by various authors in a way that, you see, once you live in a bonded reality, and this comes back to one of the questions that was raised about power and and equity and all that. Once you're in a bonded way of being, what happens is that those bonds can sometimes even be oppressive. Being bonded does not mean that there is fairness. So one of the requisites of the ethical, the root of the ethical, is being bonded. How do we ensure that these bonds are not suffocating? How do we ensure that these bonds actually encourage and promote the thriving of everybody or every being that is within that web? And this then means that if the root of the ethical is about ensuring that the bondedness allows everyone to thrive, then solidarity is at the root of the ethical. And this has been theorized, by various authors that, I won't go into actually citing, these authors, but for example, David Wiggin, even in the Western tradition, talks about solidarity as the root of the ethical. If you look at, authors like Kwesi Wiredu, when he says, what is the grounding of morality or the definition of morality? And he talks about sympathetic identification with the interest of a person or persons, of a person with those of others, even at the possible abridgment of one's own interest. If you understand that you're a bonded being, it means that you have to sometimes abridge your own interests in order to ensure that the thriving of the bonds will allow everyone to flourish. And this is why William Abraham in The Mind of Africa says that our actual success as human beings lies in the way the bonds flourish and make everybody else flourish. So our flourishing is not an individual, it's not an individualized conception. Let's move on to the next slide. So if we understand that the root of the ethical in a bonded understanding of beings and communities is the practice of solidarity, which is ensuring and creating the conditions for people within, or people and beings within the bond to be able to exercise and to live their eudaimonia, to live a successful life. Then what happens is that this generates a notion that I call deep solidarity, and solidarity becomes a way of life, which is what we've seen in some of the earlier presentations. And we see that in many communities that certain things suddenly become institutionalized, helping other people. We see them especially in times of funerals, farming, sharing of basic needs. This is just part of it. And many, African communities, we all know, and we found a lot of this in Guinea, of relatives, distant relatives, or people from your village or from somewhere, all of a sudden, requesting, if you are in a position of power, to be able to assist them. And doing so is not because you are an extremely good person, but it is just the natural way of being. Now, when deep solidarity, can you, the previous slide, please? I haven't finished with the deep solidarity, right? It is grounded on a recognition that being bonded is not always fair, and therefore we need to temper the harshness and the hardness of these relationships. And it is also grounded on the idea that the flourishing of one is linked to the flourishing of the whole. Now, deep solidarity regularly becomes institutionalized. And institutionalized does not mean it becomes a state institutionalized practice, but it can actually become community institutionalized practice that we see in farming, sharing, and all sorts of things. And then quite often we have rituals and even practices to enhance the institutionalization, because once you institutionalize something, over time, the motivation can die out. And rituals have the capacity to reenact that motivation and re-evoke it so that it can stay alive. And these rituals also include an emotional dimension to the practice of deep solidarity. But the interesting thing about deep solidarity is that it also generates obligations. Now, it can actually become normative, and this is where there is a risk of actually practicing deep solidarity, not for solidaristic motives, but rather because you do not want to be seen as not doing well within your community. Which is why sometimes you find that even in groups that are solidaristic, people will do the right thing, but they will do it for the wrong reasons. Next slide. Now, the other accounts of solidarity, which I call, responsive solidarity, and other people have theorized about ways of actually expressing this as standing up beside, for, or with, or as, with others in goal-oriented actions that are intended to improve or correct disadvantage or injustice, either in the present or the past. So something is not right, and we identify with other people, and this is the difference, for example, between certain charitable practices and solidarity. It comes from, we identify with the other people and we stand up for them, we stand up with them, or we stand up beside them in their suffering. Now, responsive solidarity is often triggered. One, it can be triggered by natural and favorable events. So in times of earthquakes, floods, famine, difficult situations, we see a surge in solidarity, that people actually come out of their corners and stand up to do things to help other people. That is one way of practicing responsive solidarity, goal-oriented, sometimes temporal, and also it carries a bit of an emotional surge because it is triggered by certain events. Then we also have a responsive solidarity that is political. The responsive solidarity that is political is more often than not geared towards conditions of injustice. And therefore, when a group of people are perceived to be treated unjustly, we stand up for them. So we can see that even in current political movements, people are standing up for the population of Gaza. And because we perceive, or because they perceive, that what is happening there to this population is unjust. And therefore, something needs to be done, and you can hold power to account. And the interesting thing about, a responsive solidarity is that it is so goal-oriented that sometimes it has very clear objectives and clear demands, and can actually bring about transformational change. Now, it can also, especially in the area of political responses and cultural responses and social responses of responsive solidarity, there is also the risk of actually creating an other, which means it can be weaponized, because you need, whereas with a natural event, you don't have a clear enemy. A flood, you can't blame the flood. But sometimes with political injustice, you know who is the author of the injustice, and therefore that person can be excluded from the solidaristic circle, and it can create forms of othering. Let's move on to the last slide, which is we don't have the last slide, but then I'll just go to global health then. How do these things apply within the global health context? In global health, we have this tendency to evoke and invoke solidarity, especially in times of disease outbreaks, in times of pandemics, or in times of health emergencies. But what we notice is that these invocations of solidarity are characterized by ambiguity. And the ambiguity could be that on the one hand, you're talking about some form of responsive solidarity, and that responsive solidarity is often empty of analytic content because it can become a secular rebaptism of aid. And it is often understood, when it is understood as a secular rebaptism of aid, then it simply becomes, what we have always been doing in global health. Oh, these poor people in X part of the world are suffering from a disease outbreak. Let's do what we can for them. And that is it. And it doesn't address the underlying commitments that we may have towards each other. Now, such acts of solidarity tend to be volatile, quite ineffective in most cases, and do not really shift praxis. What we have seen is that there is a great resistance in global health to adopt notions of deep solidarity, whereby we can actually agree that when it comes to health, either human health or planetary health, we are so deeply interrelated and bonded that we need to work on a deep solidarity framework, which will then feed the occasional responses of responsive solidarity, and make sure that that responsive solidarity lasts over time. It has clear obligations and content, and can bring about structural change. And one of the recent failures we have seen in global health trying to bring in notions of deep solidarity was what happened with the pandemic agreement. The document started off at the beginning full of solidarity, mentions of solidarity. And as the various iterations of the document were going on, solidarity gradually got purged out to just 3 words in the penultimate draft. And what is more, there was a great deal of reticence to commit to this type of solidarity. Therefore, if we want to talk about solidarity in global health, we cannot just pull it out of the hat when there is an emergency and expect it to work. We need to go back to the roots and look at the architecture of our conceptualization of health and why global health is important, and see what we can do to introduce notions of deep solidarity into it in such a way that it can serve as a structural base, and it should also serve as a launching platform for the initiatives of responsive solidarity when there are health emergencies and health outbreaks. I hope this has been synthetic enough and I've stayed within the 15 minutes.